Okay, hello everyone. My name is José Neves, and on behalf of the journal Práticas da História, Journal on Theory, Historiography and Uses of the Past, welcome. This conversation will take place after the publication of a special issue of our journal. The special issue was coordinated by Marcos, Cardão and myself, and it was published in December 2020, at least theoretically, and it is published 20 years after actually the publication of the book Provincializing Europe, and the special issue is dedicated to Dipesh Chakrabarty's groundbreaking book, also focusing some other aspects of his contribution to history and to the humanities, but mainly focusing on Provincializing Europe. The issue is composed of 10 articles and essays by researchers from various disciplinary and geographical backgrounds. And there is also an interview with Dipesh Chakrabarty, an interview recorded in Lisbon before the coronavirus actually hit us all over the world in early 2020. And also there is a chapter of the book Provincializing Europe, one of the most well-known chapters of the book, an article from the early 19th that is for the first time translated or published in Portugal. And this is also for us an opportunity, the special issue, to somehow spread the word if needed on work regarding the work of Dipesh Chakrabarty, and making it also available to Portuguese readers. I think that I speak for myself, but also for Marcos Cardão when I say that the motivation for organizing the special issue has to do with the strong influence that Dipesh Chakrabarty's book had on both of us as historians, but also as people who are concerned with the state of the world. We are very happy with the final result of the special issue. The idea was to actually gather contributions from those different disciplinary and geographical backgrounds, and I think that was done. Of course, we also had to choose if we should publish all articles in English or to keep the diversity of languages, and we finally took the second option. It would be somehow perhaps contradictory to submit all the texts to translation, even if at the same time this somehow limits Dipesh, but also other contributors' access to some of the text. But this conversation may also help to bridge some of the barriers that written language imposed. We have organized. The idea is to start this conversation asking Dipesh to make a comment, to reactions to the articles and to the essays that were published. But after that, the idea is to have an open conversation with everyone here. And those of you who are watching this conversation through YouTube, through the Institute for Contemporary History channel, you are also free to intervene by writing comments, questions and I can then echo those interventions to everyone here in this session. So I would just like to, I mean, I suppose that everyone who is watching this session is familiar with Dipesh Chakrabarty, but if that is not the case, I will just make a very short introduction. He is the Lawrence Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor of History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations in Chicago. His research fields are modern South Asian history and historiography, subaltern indigenous and minority histories, theory and history, decolonization, and in the last years, or in the last decade at least, environmental history and climate change. Perhaps we will have time also to speak a little bit about that. And that's it. With me are some of the authors, not all of them, who contributed to this special issue. Both Stråth, Saurabh Dube, Manuela Ribeiro Sanches, Patrícia Martins Marcos, and Marcelo Starcenbaum. So from different continents all over the world. That's one of the good things of the Zoom, probably the only one, but we should actually value it, even because probably it will be with us for more time than we were expecting 1 year ago. Without further ado, I just ask Dipesh to intervene. Also, you can have access to the whole issue, articles, the interview, the essays in Práticas da História. That's the link. It is by now under the column of the YouTube channel. All articles are open access. And let me also add that if you have contributions and ideas and proposals to our journal, feel free to contribute. Dipesh, and thank you very much. Thank you everyone actually, but also thank you very much to Dipesh for accepting this challenge to be commenting the articles. Who some of them critical, others critical, but also quite complimentary. But the idea is to have this conversation in a good mood. So it's your.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you everybody for being here, and thank you to the people who may be watching this or listening to it, and thank you also for organizing this special issue to mark 20 years of Provincializing Europe. I naturally feel both honored and humbled by it, because you write a book and you never know how the book is going to do, and when a book does well, it is not. I think it has a lot to do with the time when one says something and it appeals to people. Many good books don't get remarked upon on their 20th anniversary, but that doesn't mean that they're not very good books. It's just, so I also feel fortunate in that sense. And of course, when you feel fortunate about something, it humbles you, because you know that it is not simply the merit of your effort that is doing it. My effort may make some modest claim, but it is also the fact that I probably said something that that spoke to people. I mean, in fact, one of the critical articles, one of the most critical articles in the collection actually concedes that the book had a good title. So, so at least the title spoke to people, but it's this question of what you say, when you say, how you say it. And there's a pure accident of being somewhere at a particular time. And as a historian who increasingly appreciates the role of contingency in human affairs, and I say this as someone who was brought up in Marxist historiography to kind of discount contingency and place more emphasis on what was more predictable, what was more in accord with Marxist theories of society. But as I've gotten older, I've come to realize how important contingency, how important accidents are. And now that I work on climate change, when you go into large-scale happenings, the history of this planet or the history of life on this planet, contingency plays a very important role. But even in small human affairs, when a good moment comes into your life, religiously minded people would think of it as grace. Religiously minded people think of it as something that comes to you. And that's why, but even as somebody who is not as religiously minded as many others, I also think that it has a lot to do with contingency. So and that's why it's humbling. It's humbling because it could have gone some other way. And you immediately remember colleagues who write good books and then who may not have the good fortune of having that book looked at, discussed. A great friend of mine, also a very great historian in Australia, Greg Denning, who used to work on Pacific Islands and European contact with Pacific Islands, once said to me, he said, Greg was a poet at heart, a lapsed Jesuit priest actually. And he once said to me, Dipesh, writing a book, no, he's actually put in writing. He says writing a book is like letting a feather go into a deep well and then sitting there waiting for the echoes to come up. And sometimes you don't get the echoes. So I'm tremendously grateful and honored by your interest in my work, whether it's critical or not, because criticism is a form of acknowledgement of something's presence, and by what you've all collectively done. So, and I'm humbled. I mean, that is humbling. Now, I've read the articles and they invigorate my thinking in different ways. They, one of the things you realize when you've written something that has kind of undergone public discussion in one form or another over 20 years, you realize that there's something that the humanities is kind of characterized by, which is disagreement. I mean, we thrive on disagreement. My father was he was a lapsed physicist, so his training was in physics, and he was a teacher of physics before he became something else. And when I started out becoming historian, I'd been a science student and I had an undergraduate degree in physics. And my father sometimes he'd take an interest and read what I had written or what my friends had written in response to what I had written. And mostly my friends were very critical of what I wrote. And it used to hurt my father. And he used to say, is history like this? Do you always criticize each other? Is that what you do? And my father is gone. But I told him then, yes, it is like this. People criticize each other and sometimes do it very badly, very rudely, and it's hurtful. But that's what we have to do. But I also realize now that we work with prose. We work in subjects where disagreement is absolutely fundamental to excitement, to stimulation, to keeping a field alive. Sometimes disagreements are so total that the conversation stops, and sometimes disagreements are so productive that it actually furthers the conversation. And something I've learned. Sorry.
There is a little noise on the micro. I think you probably is touching in your sweat.
Oh, okay. Okay. The mic, I'm speaking to the computer mic. Is it gone now?
You speak, please.
Okay, I'll speak. So I was just saying that that how fundamental disagreements are to what we do, and the other thing, but the crisis we are in, I think disagreements are a very good thing, but the crisis of the humanities comes from many different sources. But one source is that in the humanities, we teach people to read texts and books closely. But there are so many books to read these days that people don't have the time to read books closely. So I also realized that the task of a scholar in the humanities has become so much harder. If you want to be read closely, then you have to be somebody who can make that claim on a reader's time. I mean, why should somebody read you closely when they have got 10 books to read, 12 books to read, 20 books to read in the same time? So that also makes me, even with whatever attention, is the noise continuing, sort of?
Yes, a little bit. Where do you have the micro? Is
the microphone is in the computer. I normally don't get the noise, so
okay.
Yeah, I've brought the computer close just to make sure that I'm audible.
Actually, I'm not sure if it's from Dipesh's side. It could be elsewhere. So if we could actually switch off our mute our mics,
Most of you are muted. All of you are muted.
Yeah.
All of you are muted. Yeah. Okay. Let me.
It's bad. It improved. Yes.
It improved. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So maybe it was coming from somewhere else. Yes, what I was saying. So there's also a crisis of the humanities, as I was saying, because of the crisis is many-sided, but one intellectual crisis. I mean, there's a social crisis of funding, of students not doing it, all of that. But the intellectual crisis in the humanities also is that we seldom have time to read a book twice. Sometimes we don't read a book because we only read a book because we need to cite it. And I see these reading practices all around me. So I was just going to say how lucky I am that at least some of you have looked at provincializing more than once. And that again is an extremely good fortune these days in the kinds of humanities. Now, coming to the book, I've told the story several times, particularly Saurabh here has heard me say many of these things many times, sometimes in conversations with him. Some of those conversations have gone into print. But when I wrote Provincializing Europe, the Europe I had in mind is really the Europe that is so associated with the idea of becoming modern. There are many other Europes. People sometimes, European scholars sometimes interview me to ask what I think of Europe today. And of course, Europe today is a different entity. I mean, the EU is a different entity. So the Europe I think about is the Europe that was associated with the modern, which means the Europe that was imperial, that was cruel, that took many people's lands and destroyed many civilizations, but also the Europe that underwent the so-called scientific revolution, the so-called age of discovery, a Europe that underwent revolutionary ideas to do with rights, to do with human rights, to do with citizens' rights, to do with democracy, to do with capitalism, a Europe that debated all these ideas. And the big distinction I see in the work of Europe outside of Europe is that where Europeans actually wanted not just people's labor, and often not their labor, but their land, the indigenous people. There, Europeans were at their most destructive. People died because of infectious diseases. People died because their land was taken away, and cultures died because their lives were destroyed. So my first personal encounter with the story of the indigenous people happened in Australia, because when I went there in the mid-1970s, Aboriginal history, Aboriginal past, land issue, land rights for indigenous people was an extremely important issue. So a lot of ideas in Provincializing Europe were, particularly the chapter called Minority History, Subaltern Pasts. That chapter was very influenced by the debates going on about indigenous history in Australia. And I've only been able to see this myself later on. So I've actually acknowledged, I could not acknowledge it when I finished the book, and I wasn't clear, but the more I thought about it, I've said it later, that the whole critique of history, the critique of the discipline of history, had to do not only with the study of peasants in India, which subaltern studies people were doing, but actually with debates, public debates about indigenous history. That was all around me in the 1980s in Australia, because the problem in Australia was that the written documents about Aboriginal people were only 200 years old, and they were all written by white people. So there was absolutely no source, historical source from the indigenous sites. And indigenous people would sometimes say, we dance our history, we sing our history. There was a very interesting debate about Captain Cook, the English explorer, and about his time in Northern Territories. And there's an Aboriginal song they dance to, which is about what Captain Cook did in the Northern Territories. Now, as historians, we know that Captain Cook never went to the Northern Territories. So there was a very interesting debate. Historians saying, this is not history, this is mythology. And the Aboriginal intellectuals saying, this is our history, or people sympathetic to Aboriginal historians saying, this is another kind of history. And I remember that there was a friend of mine, an Australian Aboriginal person, who did a PhD in history in my time, but he was also a poet on the side. And when he did his PhD, both history departments and English department wanted to recruit him. And he joined English department. And his name was Tony. And I said, Tony, I wanted you in history. Why did you go to English? And he told me, Dipesh, it's because I can tell my history better as poetry. He said, what I can say in poetry, I can't say in history. Now, I don't necessarily agree with his position as a historian, but those debates were tremendously invigorating. Those debates were tremendously exciting to be part of. And I realized that a lot of my critique of the discipline of history comes out of that experience. And in fact, in the interview that I did with the two of you, Jose and Marcos, I tell you the story of a friend of mine, Patrick Wolf, who eventually wrote a great book on racism and colonialism. And who, I told you that story, that he found it very difficult to teach Aboriginal students historical documents about their massacre. And they would say it's painful. And he would tell them, no, you have to get over the pain to be good historians. And it reminded me always of a psychoanalyst in Delhi finding that he couldn't treat Indians as a psychoanalyst because Indians would not focus on the triad of father, mother, and child. Indians would talk about their village uncles, their ancestors. And he finally said, I realized that I had to teach them to be my patients in order to cure them of their problems. and I always, when I think of Western disciplines, there are two stories I think about. One is this: the psychoanalyst in Delhi saying that in order to practice psychoanalysis, I have to first teach you how to be a patient of a psychoanalyst, because then I can cure you. Otherwise, you don't have a problem I can deal with. So, and the other story I think was a Kafka parable, where Kafka says that there was a society which was being disturbed by wolves. So they actually created a ritual which involved the offer of sacrificial water, sacred water, to keep the wolves at bay. And somehow the wolves got wind of this ritual that was meant to keep them away. So they would always break into the ceremony and drink the water to pollute it. And when these people found that they couldn't do anything to help it, they made the wolves breaking into the ceremony part of the ritual. Right? So in some ways, if you can't deal with the imperialists, you make them part of your ritual. And those are the two stories that told me something about relationship to imperial order. And therefore, when I read Frantz Fanon, when I read Dubois in American context, and Salman Rushdie, and this concept that Dubois had of double consciousness, or Rushdie had of speaking in forked tongue, appealed to me because I realized that one comes into modernity with this completely split feeling, or at least I do. On the one hand, you know this is your own, you want to be modern, you want to have rights, you want to have you want to have the personhood of a modern person, and you also know that this is from somewhere else, that your grandfather didn't quite live out this ideal, or your grandmother with whom you had an affectionate relationship thought differently. And so this idea of double consciousness appealed to me. But the big difference I see in the history of European colonialism is really between peoples whose lives European totally destroyed and decimated them, literally. And that's Native Americans, that's Australian Aboriginals, that's the indigenous people. And countries where they did not settle but ruled, like India, like Malaysia, like Hong Kong, where they actually created a middle class. So where British rule was actually had a creative role, in the sense that even though they colonized us, and there were racist episodes, and racist colonial difference was part of the problem, as Partha Chatterjee said, but at the same time, there was a desire to participate in European ways of life, in European forms of thinking. The excitement over English language, the excitement over learning Shakespeare and performing Shakespeare, the excitement over reading Milton, the excitement, one of the early Bengali poets actually learned Italian to read Dante and brought into Bengali poetry the Petrarchan form of the sonnet. And people were deliberately wanting to leave traditional literature to embrace European literature mediated by English. So if you look at the history of modern Indian languages, it's very hard to deny the role that either Europeans or English literature play in their formation. So when I wrote Provincializing Europe, I also realized that Europe looks different from within different colonial histories. I mean, there are similarities. There are, of course, messages about domination, about racism, and these which travel. But at the same time, there's a specificity. And even within India, the difference to the language of English is so interesting. And I think of 3 Indian writers who wrote in English. And you may not know their names, so I'll tell you their names. And they tell very different stories about their relationship to English. Well, 4. The first is the man who learned Italian to read Dante and Petrarch. His ambition was to write in English. Until an Englishman in India, this is early 19th century, told him that, look, if you write in English, however well you write, we will not consider you an English poet. Go and write in Bengali. So he brought all that knowledge into Bengali and modernized Bengali. But I think of 3 20th century writers who wrote in English. One of them clearly had a tortured relationship to English and felt it was not his language. The other man thought he knew English very well, a poet, until he went to England. And in a bar, he made such an elementary mistake in English language, used an Indianism in speaking to the working class woman who was working in the bar, that he felt so humiliated by his English being Indian, because he thought he wrote the white man's English, that he started writing in his own language, Tamil. On the other hand, there was another man called R.K. Narayan, a very well-known writer of English from the colonial times, who was promoted by Graham Greene, the English novelist. And he wrote English with no sense of any anguish. And that's within India. So I realized that even our relationship to English is not the same through the land. And that's why I had a sentence in Provincializing Europe, where I said, again, people don't have any reason to notice it, where I said, if Europe were to be provincialized from somewhere else in India, like from Madras or from Bombay, Europe would look different. The Europe I try to provincialize is actually from within the experience of becoming a modern Bengali. It's the Europe that I carry in my head. And so one of the arguments I'm trying to make is really for a more differentiated understanding of colonial Europe, a more sort of with more shades of colonial difference, different kinds of racism. I often think that for Gandhi, I mean, he may have been mistaken, but he always felt that racism was episodic, not structural. So when he was in South Africa, he believed in the rule of law so much that every time he had an encounter with racism, he went to the court because he was trained as a barrister. Whereas if I look at indigenous lives or African American lives, I find racism is completely systematic and goes into every pore of their life. Whereas there was a systematicity to racism in India in the sense that the highest positions were held by white people. And, I mean, you could not simply tell them to go. But below that, there was a lot of autonomy in our lives. And European rule allowed for forms of middle classness. And that's why Europe was exciting, because it was also the Europe of discovery, Europe of scientific revolution. So the fact that colonial India produced a physicist and a poet who got the Nobel Prize meant that that experience that our people could get the Nobel Prize, which was seen as a Western prize, it kind of underwrote a certain belief in the world that Europeans had made. And that's why Goethe's notion of world literature was translated into Indian languages, in my language, very easily by the Nobel-winning poet Tagore, or Tagore as some people call him, right? So he brought in the idea of the world to Bengali language without even thinking that the Bengali word for world, Vishwa, is actually trying to say Welt in German or something, right? So, but for this, I would not find any parallels to this in indigenous history in Australia, because their lives were destroyed. Their children were separated from their parents. The missionaries took them away forcibly to breed them white. Their children were taken away and put with foster families to breed them white. This was an experience of violence of colonial rule that we never experienced. Or the kind of experience of slavery, separation of families, so that the slaves would reconstitute family by thinking of ship-related uncles. The reconstitution of families on the ship, on passage to America. We never experienced it. So in some ways, that's one reason why I think Provincializing Europe is an open project and is a multiple project. And the second thing I want to say is that, after the book came out, all my friends from Eastern Europe, and especially a very good friend, Eva Domanska from Poland, but also I think of Monica Bar from Hungary, who is now teaching in Leiden. Eva is still in Poland, and they would all tell me, Dipesh, you should have called it Provincializing Western Europe. We didn't, we were also provincialized. And of course, there's the question of Southern Europe. And within Southern Europe, when you read Gramsci, the North-South distinction. And recently I've been reading about Picasso and Apollinaire coming into Paris and becoming friends in Montmartre, in the slummy parts of Paris. And they are immigrants from peripheral Europe coming into one of the main cities and are actually provincializing Europe from within. So I realized that if my argument is right, then the same project of provincializing Europe can be done from within Europe, because Europe becomes modern by becoming violent towards itself. Europe has to redefine the Europeans in such a way that the further east you go, the more Asiatic you become. So are the Slavs European? Are the Russians European? So there is a story of provincializing Europe that is actually a story of Europe itself. So on the one hand, it's an open multiple project because it depends on from where in the world you're looking at the world that the Europeans made while participating in the world. It's a story with resonances because there are similarities across, not identity, but similarities across them. But it's also, it can be a European project. And when you begin to look at how the peripheries, Europeans from the peripheries deal with what became Western Europe, what became canonized. So if you think about Lenin's interpretation of Marxism, what does Lenin say? What are the sources of Marxism? And you begin to see how Europe canonizes itself. And Lenin says Marx's theory is made up of what? British political economy, French spirit of revolution, and German philosophy. So there you go. That's Western Europe. It's England, France, and Germany, and which is a structure of domination that still exists in Europe. So I also realized that one can provincialize Europe from within Europe itself. And so maybe I'll end there, and as the conversation proceeds, we can come into more comments. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dipesh. I don't know if any other author wants to intervene right now, because there are obviously some connections between what you were saying actually in this second half of your intervention and some of the articles, in the sense that Patrícia, Marcelo, and Saurabh, they somehow try to read Provincializing Europe in the context of their own research or teaching experience, in the case of Saurabh, in South or Latin America, and actually in the case of South and Latin America, also the issue of what we call the West, it also becomes problematic. And so the sensitivity to the differences within Europe that you were mentioning also obviously makes sense when we speak about the West in general terms. And obviously there is this tradition of the subaltern Latin American studies, but moreover also the colonial studies, etc. I don't know if any of Marcelo, Patrícia, or Saurabh want to intervene on this. And I would leave for a second round both Manuel and both Stråth, because their articles, if I am able to connect them to your intervention. In the case of Manuel, quite clearly you are not able to read it in Portuguese, so I will translate it, and Manuela will amend me if I'm doing it on the wrong way. But for Manuela, it was really relevant to underline the heterogeneity of the European, what we can call the European intellectual tradition. And yes, but I don't know, Marcelo, Saurabh, or Patrícia, if any of you want to intervene.
I think maybe Marcelo can go first, I can go after.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jose and Marcos, for the organizing of this meeting. Well, yes, obviously there's a link between the reading of Marx developed by Dipesh and some readings developed in Latin America, because obviously the third world reading of Marx and the idea of the periphery. I would like to comment or ask Dipesh on Provincializing Europe as a Marxist book, because I was reading a lot on the reception of the book across humanities and social sciences, and I think that there are two opposite readings related to Marx. First, I realized that there is a reading that suggests that Provincializing Europe represents a kind of defeat of Marxism at the age of globalization, postmodernism, post-structuralist theory. And on the other hand, there is a reading that suggests the opposite. Provincializing Europe represents a kind of persistence of Marxism at the age of globalization, post-structuralist theory, postmodernism. So the question would be on that reading, that ambivalent reading of Marx, that could result in different readings, and that's the same situation in Latin America. And I think Marxist intellectuals try to open Marxism to other traditions, and they were accused of anti-Marxist or dogmatist, the two opposite readings. So I think it's a general comment on the relation, or the relation between Marx and different traditions outside Marxism. So I think it's the same discussion in Latin America between 80s and beginnings of the 21st century, I think.
Thank you. I don't know, Dipesh, you want to react right now, and then Patrícia can intervene.
Maybe let's hear Patrícia, and then I can come back again. So we'll have a lot of different voices. Yeah,
I agree with you. Patrícia, please.
Well, good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be in such august company. I think to me, as someone who is training, finishing a PhD in the United States, and who trained in Portugal, but lived in Northern Europe for many years, like I did, to me, reaching the point where I read Provincializing Europe was very interesting, because I was training in history of science and medicine, and specifically, and we read Provincializing Europe in a few different seminars in a few different contexts, which was very interesting. And I think one thing that I still find very curious about the power, and I think it says a lot about the power of the project, is that the verb provincializing became sort of a method now, and you see it is deployed in that way in several books, in projects of provincializing this or that. And it's not just Europe, it's race and it's other things. So I think that speaks a lot to its portability in some sense, and how pliable it is somewhat, and the kind of potential that people saw in the project that I think remains very much alive. But to me, one thing that spoke to me a lot, which was the concept that I kind of honed in the text that I wrote, was the idea of several temporalities, which for me was something very, very real that I recognized and realized when I reached the United States, and I wanted to work on Portuguese colonialism through the lens of science and medicine. And suddenly I had to justify that there was not only this sort of peripheral empire, it is enduring. I mean, I think Portuguese historians or historians of the Portuguese Empire in the United States will encounter this question a lot. Why Portugal? Why not Spain? Or why not another empire? And all this to say that we come at the realization that, the very real realization that Portugal is neither obviously Europe in the way that the Europe you located is imagined, which is kind of this ideological construction. Portugal is neither that Europe that people imagine, and it's not that Europe in Northern Europe either. But it's also not an obvious empire. It's seen as something peripheral that people don't really know about. And it, to me personally, from my experience, it was even odder, because there was really no history of science kind of to speak of. And that was very, very interesting, because especially to hear you talk about the great benchmarks, the scientific revolution, and where we attach ideas of progress to. And it's very, again, I think that's part of the narrative that Portugal built, and Portuguese historians and other people who work on this context built sometimes very critically, and I think we still engage or deal with those problems quite a bit, with the idea of empire and the glorification of empire to some extent, is exactly the scientific revolution. Is that great moment where we were part of Europe, and the Europe ideology became real again in Portuguese post-revolution, where suddenly there was the European Union and we would become European. So there's always this push and pull in Portugal between this imperial, highly fetishized narrative and the notion of Europe, which is this construction that is just a filler space. There's some vague ideas about being more developed or higher up in a hierarchy of being than somewhere else or someone else. But it's nothing really concrete, which I think it's exactly why it's so seductive and it has so much power. So I think that idea, I think we're still dealing with it and we're still unpacking it quite a bit, especially with where does Europe exist as a unit, and where does a place like Portugal and an empire and a form of colonization like Portugal fit within all that grand narrative? And especially, do we need the grand narrative, or should we just continue unpacking it? Because maybe that will prove even more along the lines, more generative along the lines of what you were talking about in terms of pluralizing, if I understood you correctly, pluralizing the Europes. And interestingly, there was a project that was the historiography of science and medicine did sort of in the 80s and early 90s, and it was sort of lost, seeking the locality of things. And then the global move kind of made the local within a broader context. So I was wondering how you see the portability of the idea of provincializing many things within that context of globality, of global history, of histories of movements, but at the same time of realities that need to be contextualized at a great deal of definition. Otherwise, they risk losing all meaning. No, that's it. That's sort of what I had in.
Can I respond to these two people, because otherwise I'll lose track? And so I'll respond to what Marcelo said about Marxism. And Patrícia, I'm taking 3 points out of what you just said. And if I miss out on others, or even if I miss out on things within those 3 points, please come back. Feel free to come back and push the conversation. So 3 points I take from you is, one is, of course, portability.
Dipesh, can
how to explain the portability of the idea of Europe, and why does it travel? What travels? Or traveling theory, as Jim Clifford and Edward Said used to call it. The second question that you also raised is this question of the move in the 80s and 90s for situated knowledge. Even Donna Haraway used to speak of that, and that kind of got sort of washed away by a move towards the global. So what happened to the local in that move towards the global? I think that's a fascinating problem. So those are the two I remember, and there are other things that you raised, so please feel free to come back and let me respond to those. I think the third one, it'll probably come back to me. So Marcelo, the question I was asking through Marx was, when Marxism comes, or even when liberalism comes, liberalism comes as a way of explaining your life, as does Marxism, right? It's a story about who you are. So, like, I never grew up thinking that I was middle class until I encountered sociology. I grew up knowing that I had some relatives who were richer, I had some relatives who were poorer, but I had to encounter some kind of sociological language to know that I was middle class. Similarly, to know that I was petit bourgeois, I had to encounter some Marxist language. So Marxism, it's a grid of interpretation. And my question was the fact that we do not come to Marxism or any other reason without history. So when we interpret our lives in terms of the categories of this received framework, we also engage in translation. And these translations mean, in practically, that when you become even a factory worker or a typist, you do not lose all of that history that comes to you from your grandparents, their grandparents, from stories in family, rituals, bodily language. You don't lose all of that. And sometimes you find out about that. See, so long as all those previous histories work in tandem with that which produces profit, you don't see those histories, nobody minds. It's only when they cease to work to produce profit that they become visible. To give you a concrete example, I know of so many typists because I grew up in the age of the typewriter. In India, the typewriters were manual. I went to Australia and I discovered electric typewriters and golf ball typewriters. My thesis was printed with a golf ball typewriter, where all the alphabet were on a golf ball, right? And then came the word processor. And I know so many typists who did not like the word processor, because word processor meant more work. They would now do 5 drafts of something. And they wanted the typewriting machine back. So at that moment you realized that they had a relationship to the typewriting machine, which was in excess of what the logic of profit making required them to have. Or this comes out very clearly in a Bengali, well-known Bengali film, which is about a man's love for his old car. And this you find in many cultures. People fall in love with their cars. They decorate it, they polish it, right? They do all kinds of things, particularly young people with their cars. Now, that relationship of love to the car is in excess of what the auto manufacturer wants out of it. The auto manufacturer wants you to buy another car. And the auto manufacturer doesn't give a damn whether you actually care for it, whether you shine it or polish it or buff it, right? There's some other idea of masculinity or some other idea of personhood that goes into there. And it's only when there's a breakdown between the relationship for profit making and this other relationship that you begin to see this other relationship. So actually something I said, but it's only in a passing, is that history twos are always visible post fact. So you cannot create a program of history two. So I cannot say that I will create a revolutionary program out of history twos, because history twos become visible only when my relationship that seemed productive with regard to capital breaks down, because the strategy for accumulation has changed. And I don't change my behavior. And there are so many short stories in Indian literature about precisely the worker who suddenly feels lonely, bereft, left behind, because something he or she loved at work has been taken away. And a lot of the history of capitalism, early history, is actually the love between a worker and the machine. And I don't mean big machines, but machines you can manipulate, machines you can care for, machines you fix, you repair. And that, of course, in capitalism, that's taken away from you. But there's a long period, in India, there was a long period of actually the dependence on light mechanical engineering. You know, people loved repairing their bicycles. Really good. So, and that relationship between a human and non-human, affective relationship, can't be explained by the logic of surplus value. And that for me was history too. And I was reading Marx to see if Marx would allow me within his framework to speak of this. And I found that he did. Whether he did it intentionally or unintentionally, I don't know. But the fact that he himself wrote saying there's a history that belongs to the life, to the reproduction of capital, and there's a history that does not belong to the life of capital, allows me to say this. And what I wanted to say was my own observation, but I wanted to say it through Marx because of my attachment to Marx. I mean, as I say in my interview, I never became an anti-Marxist, though I find Marx limiting in many ways. So that's to answer your question. And to go back to your points, Patricia. So one of the problems of Americanization of the humanities is that concepts have to become slogans. Unsaid concepts become slogans. They don't travel. So Foucault becomes knowledge is power, as if we're reading Bacon, not Foucault. You know, Ben Anderson becomes nations are imagined communities. And of course, I'm grateful that provincializing travels. And as I said, I'm grateful to the accident of that happening. But it's also because provincializing means many different things. So what happens is when a concept becomes, and this is what's happening with Anthropocene. So when a concept becomes a name and not a concept, then it becomes polysemic. It takes on many meanings. And sometimes somebody, so I think, Paul Crutzen, the man who renewed the word Anthropocene for us, he said it in a conference in Mexico, where everybody was going on about Holocene, 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 and he just said, all this rubbish, we're in Anthropocene. And created a peculiar problem that now the stratigraphers have to go around, look for evidence in the strata to say, yes, it's an acceptable word. So normally in geology, you first find evidence, like in history, you find evidence, and on that basis, you argue for something. But here the argument was made before the evidence was found. So now they have to go and find the evidence. So it often reminds me of that play by Pirandello, that 6 characters in search of an author. So the Anthropocene is like geologists are going around the world trying to find evidence. So yes, provincializing traveled. But I think it traveled for this reason that we are in an age where it's an age of democracy. It's an age in which difference is celebrated, sometimes too much. And therefore we say to all that is powerful, I'll provincialize you. Now their provincializing means I will put you back in your box. And I did not quite mean that. I actually said, how do I make my own that which I also recognize as universal? In other words, difference was part of the universal. And how do I write my difference back into the universal as difference within? What I was doing later on, I realized it was more like Adorno's negative dialectics, right? But I think Bo wanted to say something. Bo?
I didn't want to interrupt you, Dipesh. I just wanted to ask for the floor after you.
Dipesh, you are muted.
Okay, then I'll quickly talk about the global and the local, and then stop for Saurabh and others to come in.
Manuela and Bo, yes, they can.
Yeah, sure. So with the global and the local, I completely agree with you, Patricia. I mean, see, there's a footnote in your piece, which I loved reading, which I should have known this, that even the word name Brazil has to do with material resources. Extractive, the early extractive capitalism, naming the place after a particular kind of wood, was just kind of the name tells it all, and I thought, goodness. The Ottomans ran out of timber very quickly. I mean, in fact, when you read the history of the relationship between empire and timber, and that's almost a global history of empires, for shipbuilding and all kinds of things, timber is the basic resource. And I didn't realize that the history of extractive capitalism was imprinted permanently on the name of a nation. It just blew me away, and I just thought, wow, that there's so much history in that little footnote that you had, apart from the school that you went to and the ancestral connections you talked about. And what happened was a certain kind of, there's a certain kind of scholarship now which is extremely unappreciative of the local and thinks that anything is a nodal point in a network of connections. And what they forget is that people everywhere, humans, have a capacity to give themselves the experience of deep time. I'm not talking about geological deep time. Your relationship to your ancestors gives you a sense of time deeper than your own life. I mean, Saurabh's relationship to his parents is always there in what he writes, what he talks about, what he says. Saurabh would often begin by saying, I'm the son of two anthropologists. Now that's a time that is longer than his own life. And I think people who do this kind of global, so one of the persons in this book who says that I should have written transnational history, the person who writes on nationalism in Japan, right? Who says that for provincializing, I should have written transnational history. He does not realize what my project is. And I realize what his project is, and that's another way of provincializing, but it's different from what I was trying to do. Because my project was that the reason why I went back into my Bengali-ness, as it were, was because I realized it is only in this one language in the world that if you gave me a page of printed Bengali, I will be able to tell you that this sentence is from before the 18th century. I'd be able to tell you that this word is probably from the 12th century. And this sentence is post-English on the same page. I cannot do this with any other language in the world. That's my lack of knowledge. But it's also what gives my sense of being a Bengali a certain kind of historical depth. And it is by mobilizing that historical depth I wanted to provincialize Europe. That was mine. So I wanted to, as it were, figure out the relationship between the sentence, Bengali sentence that is post-English, and the Bengali sentence that is pre-colonial, and the Bengali sentence that may be pre-Muslim, the Bengali sentence that may be before Bengali. And the problem with these kind of global scholars, I feel, is that they really represent a certain kind of rootlessness. They enjoy the condition of rootlessness, while I enjoy the condition of, for a lack of better metaphor, being rooted. You know, there's an Australian poet called Judith Wright, and her life was written by a Catholic nun called Veronica Brady. And Judith Wright was an white Australian person who wrote about Australia, indigenous people, but from a white perspective. And Veronica Brady, once in discussing Judith's life, Wright's life, said that for Judith, being an Australian was an erotic experience. And when I read that, I realized that for me, being a Bengali is always an erotic experience. I love this language. I bemoan the fact that that English is always a second language. I bemoan it. Because every time I write something in Bengali, I realize that I can do more with this language than I can do with English. And when I read somebody like E.P. Thompson, I realize that guy does more with his English, because for him, being in English was an erotic experience. And that's why he wrote a loving but critical essay called The Peculiarities of the English. In my head, I always criticize Bengali in terms of the peculiarities, but participating in peculiarities of a place, time, language is what gives you a sense of being connected in a particular way to historicity. And I think these people who make the global really global have no sense of historicality. They only have a sense of very shallow event history, and a very kind of a superficial sense of capitalism as a connecting thread. And I honestly find in those histories a certain kind of evacuation of the human experience, which I will never go for. But I'll say this thing and finish this. But this is the third point I now remember. You see, when I was writing Provincializing, there was a man whose statements guided me in thinking that I'm not the only one with this affect for Europe, even though it's a mental construction. But I have a positive affect for Europe. I actually think this place was so dramatic. I mean, think of Europe as a drama. It's a cruel character. It's destructive. It's creating other things. It's creating science. It's creating new institutions. It's creating academies and universities, creating philosophy while destroying the world. And now with the Anthropocene, we realize why this world that Europe made doesn't work. After 500 years, we realized that this world is seriously problematic. But it was tremendously exciting. I mean, if I could live somewhere as an observer for those 500 years, I mean, Europe would be a fascinating character to write about in a drama about the world. And I was fascinated by it. And the other person was fascinated by it and similarly disappointed in it. And that's a person who was at my mentor, was Frantz Fanon. So at the end of The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon says, European thought have all the ingredients that are needed for a better world. But Europeans have failed to produce the formula. How to mix them? It is to other people. It is up to other people to actually make use of European thought, to create that other time, other century. And so that was the third thing I wanted to say, is that, and Fanon's remark spoke to my sense of who I was, spoke to my sense of this whole history in which my ancestors were so excited. The man who is known of the father of modern India, who lived from 1772 to 1833, was a correspondent of Jeremy Bentham and wanted India to be like Latin America, to be settled by Europeans who would marry Indians, create a mestizo class, and modernize India. He didn't want Europeans like the British who would come and not marry us. And he wanted a republican form of rule. And all that is part of my sense of who I am. So even though Fanon comes from Martinique, from the history of slavery, and when I read that sentence in At the Wretched of the Earth, that sentence was what gave me confidence to write the book.
Thank you, Dipesh. Saurabh, you wanted to intervene,
and Bo wanted to say something.
Bo also, yes, and then Manuela, yes. I don't know. Bo, you want to start?
Yeah. I have a question, but if I'm on the list, I don't know. I just wanted to put.
No.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dipesh. Thank you, Jose and Marcos. I have a question, Dipesh. Could you imagine to write this book today? What would it look like? How different are we from that situation? I mean, of course, what your point about contingency and open-ended history and all that has been even stronger since you wrote this, I think. So there you are very much concerned. But what I see or read in your book, which I found so fascinating, was the two levels of history 1 and history 2. And when I read it, and evermore when I read it again, so I thought it's reason of history as level 1. I think I would rather see history 1 as the master narrative. You can Hegel, Marx, and then we had imperialism was of course one kind of understanding, modernization and globalization. And you were just in the breaking point between modernization and globalization. And then you have history 2, which is, in your case, it can be both from within and from without, as you just said. And I mean, you demonstrate it by references to Heidegger. It is really from within, and then you take your Bengal peasants and poets. And I think this is a fascinating history. But what is it worth today, this history too? I mean, it is not just enough to make them parallel and say you have the farmers, the peasants and the poets in India, and they have another view and they comment on it, but they must engage with it. That is and that is a potential of a protest here, a confrontation, struggle with the two. And here is, where do you see today? Where is history 2? History 1 and history 2 today?
Yes.
Should I come in here, or do you want to listen to Saurabh and Manuela?
Well, as you prefer, but I would prefer. Actually, I would prefer.
Maybe quickly. Okay. No. Thank you both for writing, being interested in my work. You've been very kindly for a very long time, and your friendship has meant so much. And you've actually brought me into contact with other scholars from whom I've learned, and some of whom have become lifelong friends. I think of your student Henning Trooper as a lifelong friend, including yourself. And these have been very enriching experiences of life. So I got to know a bit of real Europe, having provincialized the imaginary one through you guys. Where is history 1, history 2 today? So I'm actually writing a book now calling Provincializing Europe in a Warming World, which is really because many people have asked me what is the relationship between Provincializing Europe and the climate book, which is out this month. And also I gave lectures in Mandel, called the Mandel lectures at Brandeis University under this title. So I have to deliver them the lectures. But see, so there are two connections I see already, both which goes to both history 1 and history 2 in different ways. One is that, that the narrative of catching up, what I said not yet, that narrative of catching up is so powerful in China and India today. So is that pro-colonial, and that's what causing what a friend of mine called the Asian Anthropocene. In other words, going forward, if China and India with their population consume fossil fuels, then we will have a problem of a much bigger order, because they're becoming richer, their numbers are much larger, and the problem will be humongous. So in a very interesting way, the Chinese and the Indian desire to catch up with the West, which is already showing in the fact that 3 of the 3 billion people now in the world who consume gadgets like fridge, refrigerator, cars, almost 70% are not Europeans or Americans. They're Chinese, Indian, African, this upcoming new middle class, Brazil and these other places. So history 1, the master narrative, the West, America as a developmental goal, or the notion of being like America, is very powerful both with India and China. China is already part of the Security Council. India's ambition is to be part of the Security Council. And that's what they prioritize over everything else. So history 1, in your terms, the master narrative of growth and power is not gone, it's around us. But where history 2 comes in is in this proposition that the more I work on climate change, the more I realize that humans are a minority form of life on this planet. So we dominate the order of life, we are causing extinctions, but the bulk of life on the planet are microbes, are viruses and bacteria, because we have mostly destroyed animal life. Animal life is small, and it's because we are destroying them that we are getting the zoonotic diseases. So the bulk of so I've actually been thinking that if humans want to survive on this world and and allow the world to survive, then humans should not act the way that white people acted in apartheid South Africa, where they were a minority, but they dominated the whole place. Humans will have to learn to live as a minor form of life, which means withdrawing, allowing other forms of life to thrive. But it also means learning from people who thought in this minoritarian ways, not majoritarian ways. And where do you go? You could go to Gandhi in South Africa. You could go to Hannah Arendt's writing on how the Jews should be in Palestine. I mean, she was opposed to the setting up of a Jewish majority state. You know, she wanted the Jewish people to be there alongside Palestinians and nobody to form a majoritarian state. So there are actually thinkers you can go to think, and that is a subject I discuss in the minority history chapters, where I discuss Kafka through Deleuze, or this whole question of minoritarian writing, minoritarian thinking. So if today I had to think about so that I see as another connection between something that interested me in Provincializing Europe and something that still interests me, which is how to fight the majoritarian forms of thought, which will be practiced by a powerful minority. The powerful minority, in effect, becomes a majority. So the British in India were such a powerful minority that, in effect, they acted like a majority. And therefore, how to reject majoritarian forms of thought, even if you're not a majority. Something I think we'll have to eventually practice it if you want to save biodiversity and save ourselves. Without giving up on things we value necessarily. So that's a quick answer, but we can come back to this. Okay, I'll mute my mic.
Okay, Saurabh.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah, I think Saurabh has some difficulties. Saurabh, we are not. You're a little bit. The connection is not working that well.
Jose,
You're muted.
And the image is from.
No.
Oh, the image is.
No, I'm not.
We can hear you. You're breaking up, and your image is frozen.
Perhaps if you
that's been happening actually.
If you block the video,
Is it still breaking up?
A little bit.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay.
I'll do that.
Use the only the.
Is that better now?
Yes, probably. Or not.
Is it better now?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Can you?
Yes. You can speak. Yes.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay. Just give me a. Yeah. Just give me a second. I'll move.
Okay. So we will move to Manuela.
Okay. So I mean, I can just go downstairs. It'll take like 10 seconds. It'll take 15 seconds. Yeah.
That's probably we have 2 floors when you.
Well, this is the study upstairs.
Okay. I'm joking.
It was.
But perhaps we can move to Manuela and then give you the word after Manuela.
Well, I'm there. Whatever you want.
We will wait.
Is it better now?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so let me even try it with the. I'm sorry about this. It seems to happen at crucial moments.
It happens.
Okay, so I do not actually have questions for Dipesh. I suspect I've haunted, even badgered him with questions over something like 20 years, over 20 years now.
To my pleasure and.
Thank you, Dipesh. So I actually I had a set of comments which related to the issue, of course, to the special volume, but as well to the comments by Patrícia, by Bo, by Marcelo. And the first is, I'll try to be very quick. So, Marcelo, you spoke about the way in which, the contentions within Marxism. Each time there's a move to do something new, there's this kind of a fear which comes in. And I must say that in the mid-1980s, as a student, I was already attracted to Dipesh's work, just having read very little bits of it in draft, because, he carried the label of a heretic within Marxism. And, when you're a student of a particular kind, you like heretics. And this derived not from Provincializing Europe, it actually derived from what was to become rethinking working class history. And I shall not go into the arguments there, but here was this heretic, you see, who shouldn't have been read, we were being told. As a part of and we were excited as a part of the larger project of subaltern studies and so on. My second point is basically what I learned from Dipesh, in the I think we first met in 1989, but in the 1990s, that the work of scholarship is not about providing solutions, coming up with resolutions. And it was not a blazing discovery, it happened gradually. But is the work of scholarship always about solutions and providing solutions, coming up with resolutions? Or is it asking about questions? Now, you see, in the 1990s, in a sustained way, when I started meeting Dipesh, what was happening? Yes, modernization theory was in decline, people were celebrating globalization, modernity was at large. But there was also something else around, which was anti-essentialism was in the air, right? So anti-essentialism, and that accounts for some of the readings of Provincializing Europe. It accounts for that anti-essentialism, accounts for the way in which nationalism was understood as a project of power, et cetera, et cetera. The question was, and this came out, as I said, gradually, that essentialisms are not just distant enemies. Essentialisms are of the world. Nationalisms are worlded. We may not like them, but nationalisms and nations are of the world. They have worldly attributes and densely worldly sensuous attributes. So this was something that I was learning gradually, especially as I started teaching at the Colegio de Mexico in the mid-1990s. Now, there we were reading, of course, not Provincializing Europe, but the postcoloniality and the artifice of history. But since, Jose brought up this question, how were we reading it in a seminar of MA, some PhD students? We were actually reading postcoloniality and the artifice of history together with questions of settler colonialism. Dipesh's friend Patrick Wolf, although we didn't know that he was a friend, writing on Marxist theory and settler colonialism. We were reading it together with Violence of Colonialism, but in terms of the poetics of a Michael Taussig, writing in his Shamanism, Colonialism, and the Wild Man. So what was happening there was that there were we were reading these texts with students who represented different sides of the military rule in Argentina, which was only 15 years old. We were reading it in terms of the wonderful couple, delightful Renato and Renata. Renata was Mexican, and Renato, who was from Brazil. And we were discussing it in terms of questions of race when Renato got really annoyed. He was self-described mulatto, and he said, Dube, I will tell you, I'll tell the seminar what racism is. The white guys come and they fuck our women and they say they deserved it because they dance like that. Okay, so we were discussing. So, what I'm basically getting at is that, in a sense, the questions reading postcoloniality and the artifice of history, the questions of universal history and a singular modernity were acquiring or had acquired, a certain, distinct cadences. They had acquired textures. And they led me to think actually of two sets of scandals. One was the scandal of the West, pervasive presumptions of the West as we know the rest of it. But the other was, the scandal of the nation, persistent projections of the nation as a kind of a savior. And if there was a possibility for critical scholarship, and I found Dipesh pointing towards that, particularly in his Politics of Despair, the undemocratic foundations of democracy, it was actually by holding together the scandal of the West and the nation, right? So these were the dynamics of class. And, I discuss it very briefly, how Asia and Africa are approached in terms of, in two terms, you see, and, Latin American worlds at large, but certainly in the Centro de Estudios de Asia y Africa, they were approached in terms of something which represented marvelous difference from the West, right? Algo bello. And they represented at the same time the mark of backwardness, something dark, dangerous, the algo feo. Now, the point was that the algo bello and the algo feo were not separate. They were mixed up with each other. So the challenge, in some sense, and this was experiential. So in some senses, there was a lot which Dipesh's post-coloniality article and later Provincializing Europe were doing in the class, but there's also what the class was doing to these articles, to the article and the book and other writings. Okay, now this gets me actually to the entire question of this Provincializing Europe was traveling, Patrícia, but it was traveling in a manner very different from the way it traveled in North America. And I'm not setting up, a deep divide between, the south and the north of Rio Grande. It's the way in which we discuss text. But it is true, as Dipesh said, that in the North American academe, what you have is a tendency to turn towards buzzwords. You need Provincializing Europe, imagine communities, you need buzzwords, you hang on to them, and then you can misinterpret them, you can do what you wish with them. And I think in part it's because people are made to just read so much, and to be clever and to be smart. I mean, I didn't think of clever and smart as good words, but in the US, if you're smart and clever, well, you're clever and smart. So, Shahid has spoken about it. He's asked the question, why is it that theories travel? Why is it that histories do not travel? But as someone who's sort of worked, between history and anthropology, I found that ethnographies, in some senses, do travel in their own ways. So the question then, in terms of reading Dipesh along with other texts, became in class, how were we to read these in terms of practices, not just of critique, but of critical affirmation? Okay, and here I go to your introduction, Jose, where you speak about how the rescuing of subalterns from the condescension of enormous posterity was accompanied by an emphasis on the individual. And yet, as we read, let's say, Microhistoria in class, the question was, yes, they wanted the proper nouns of history. They wanted the particular subjects of history to be rescued. And there were limits there. But, what kind of a subject was rescued by Giovanni Levi, in terms of what kind of a subject was he? What kinds of challenges were there to the notions of the individual and the subject? And also what kind of a subject was there which came up, not in Carlo Ginzburg's, not just in Cheese in the Works, the Miller, but what kinds of subjects were there in the night battles, the good walkers? What kind of, so these were the aspects of critical affirmation in terms of reading histories which could travel as well, together with theory. And we read Dipesh in terms of traveling ethnographies, histories, and theory, which gets me to the final point. And it's bound again to the importance of questions, the place of experience, and the presence of the world. And this relates to the point which Dipesh made about the devaluing of the local, which has been called the glocal by some, which is a but also this kind of a celebration of the transnational, or the celebration of global history, the celebration of transnational history as if it's going to resolve problems. But guess what? As multiculturalism was saying, including with some of my friends, that the transnational is around global, histories have to become global, have to become transnational. What happened in our decade? Nationalism came back with a vengeance. Whether it is Modi's India, or China was always there buying up Africa. It was Brazil. It was Boris Johnson. It's our good friend Mr. Trump, but Mr. Biden too. I mean, in a different way. In other words, nationalism was back, and as far as the historians' celebration of transnational and global histories were concerned, it had rained on the parade even before the parade started. So, how confined are we going to be to the worlds of academic history writing? Doesn't that, in some senses, signal a certain way of approaching the world which are mentalist? And I think, the long engagement with Dipesh has precisely pointed me towards these conundrums, which I see as questions, which one grapples with, which one stays with and thinks through, rather than resolves, and absolves. Thank you.
Thank you, Saurabh. I'll just, Manuela, do you want to intervene right now? And then I will, Dipesh, then you will have the final word, okay?
Okay, I'll try to be very brief.
Manuela, yeah, I think, yeah, we haven't heard from Manuela. She's been silent for a long, long time. Very patient.
No, a patient woman. Anyway, I don't have much to say. What I wanted to perhaps to go back to some points, because I think that Dipesh, in a sense, addressed many of the issues I was thinking about. One of the things would be contingency. I hadn't thought about it this way, but I think that the word, in this way, captures quite well the kind of approach I was intending to evoke. So my text, it wasn't translated, would be also interesting, but I won't elaborate on that, why I decided to publish it in Portuguese. But of course, this also relates to the local and how you feel much more at home while you are writing your mother tongue, as we call it in Portuguese. But besides from that, there is a certain form of contingency in my encounter, so to say, with Provincializing Europe and later with Dipesh. I remember that very well. Hayden White, which is also an interesting accident, which doesn't happen really by accident. One could almost read a form of necessity in this suggestion to invite Dipesh for a small meeting. This was a long time ago, 2003 or 2004. Actually, it was about translating or trying to make post-colonial theory travel into Portugal, where it was still very much unacknowledged and people weren't really aware of that. Of course, it was the impact of the global, but trying to do it in a way in which, this is another central concept for me, a practice too, in which these theories would be translated, not only would travel, seamlessly, and just adapted and becoming new buzzwords, which, by the way, also happens in Portugal. These are the bad things we've been learning from the US Academy, and I completely agree with you. But it was also about the limits of these travels. How far are they able to travel? And what happens, this is also what Edward Said wrote about, what happens to these theories when they travel? Are they tamed? Are they radicalized? This was also about experimenting with this. And actually, it seems that this small experiment, where there weren't many people, as you remember, many people, most of the people didn't even know who Dipesh was gave some fruits apparently, because through the translation of a precise text, and I also would like to address, I realized years later that there was a new generation of historians, mostly historians, I would say, who were really engaging with your theories and your approaches. At least this was my sense in a very particular setting, which I'm not going now to evoke because this would take me too much time. But what I do in my texts is drawing on my experience of translating your texts. Number one, I chose minority history's subaltern past. And why did I do it? Because to me, it was the most enigmatic part of the text. The one which was, for me, trained in Western thought, absolutely, German and English. To me, it was the most enigmatic in the sense that I couldn't really get what you wanted to say about these subaltern pasts. There was this kind of, I would say, opaqueness, which through the act of translation acquired a form of translucidity, which is also interesting, a concept to use, which means that I still haven't really understood it. And this is also an important part of the whole hermeneutical tradition. What is understanding? How much do you understand? Something about which I really think about when I read the texts that I don't understand. Why do I want to understand everything? Why do I want to obtain this kind of transparency, which perhaps does never exist? So all these things came up while I was translating, and translating in the sense, I mean, now the practical act of translating from English into Portuguese also made me aware, as in many other cases, how much what you were just addressing, this need of the close reading, that people read so fast. Of course, there is this productive misunderstanding, which is well known, but nevertheless, you read too much. I realize this in the United States, but in Portugal, it's also becoming kind of a trend. So you cannot read, I don't know, I remember in the US once there was a professor was demanding that the students read the Schiller's letters on the aesthetic education of mankind or humankind for a seminar, and the next week would be Kant's critique of judgment, you know. And I thought, how will you need years to read that, at least Kant's critique of judgment. And so this haste to read and not even making this effort of trying to understand or realizing that sometimes you do not understand, in a sense, brought me to the, I would say, the nucleus of your project of Provincializing Europe. Because what I think you are doing, and I think you confirmed this today, I might be, again, not have understood you, is an act of translation, again, living between two worlds and trying to make sense of both and being embedded in both. And sometimes not willing, there is this kind of undecidability about to which world you want to belong to, which makes it to me so interesting. Because I do think that and the way you also address this, you also relate to the Enlightenment tradition, which to me, for theoretical and biographical reasons, also appeals to me a lot. I really found fascinating because it grounds itself on ambiguities, on hesitations, on the same way when you are translating a text, you have to stop. You have doubts. What is the exact word? And then finding out there is no exact word. But this doesn't mean that the original isn't worth going back to. You don't have to throw the original. But through this translation act, you also realize how much of, as you also write, difference has to be maintained. So I think that if I understood something, it was through of your text, it was through the act of translation, this very practical act. And which made me demanded this close reading. And this also brought to me in the process of writing about the text now recently, also brought in me a lot of associations, so to say. So all of a sudden, it reminded me of Siegfried Kracauer, which makes another long excursus at the end, and his last things before the last, and his concept of the antechamber of history, and the way in which I also start to relate this with his Jewish condition, your dialogue, your letter with Amitav Ghosh, which I always found so very fascinating. I had to go back to. So in sum, I don't have a question as usual, because I'm not clever or smart to have questions. But what I wanted to say here is that in a sense, what you were talking about one, contingency, and two, this idea of this multiple projects that emerge from this provincializing Europe, also within Europe, to me make full sense through this act of translation, in which you juggle with two worlds, you inhabit two worlds at the same time, of always being more comfortable in your own home. And I'm not a Heideggerian at all. Anyway, and while translating and going back to your text, but this you can look up. I also found a very, very interesting footnote on Heidegger and about being rooted and traveling, which I thought was also fascinating. But this needs to conclude a close reading, and if I could add, a slow reading of text. And I really appreciate that you mentioned this in your intervention, but I don't have any questions. And I've already spoken too much. You go ahead. And thank you for your book and your interventions.
Okay, thank you, Manuela. Actually, Manuela translated the chapter from Provincializing Europe in the book she edited, Deslocalizar Europa, Delocalizing Europe, and in 2010 she also translated an essay by Dipesh. It's called Subaltern as Political Thought, where actually the issue of the individual as a historiographical form is debated by Dipesh against, or at least criticizing history from below, and specifically the crowding history from Georges Roudet. But before I just pass the word to Dipesh for the final comment, Patrícia wanted to make a short intervention. Yes.
Yes, I just had a small follow-up, and I totally agree with the urge to read. I myself have, when I prepared qualifying exams, I had a very hard time going back to a non-frantic mode of reading. But I also just wanted to just say something about the buzzword. And I think that we are taking provincializing, the verb that became method, perhaps on too negative of a lens, because from, for example, the perspective of the history of science and medicine, which has had over the last 20 years a decisive move. So in some sense, I think provincializing captured the zeitgeist very well in a certain moment when several fields of history were changing and were expanding their geographical scope, where history of medicine and science and the possibility of medicine and science was moving to Asia and to Africa and to Latin America. Those fields became consolidated in the early 2000s, and I think there's a dialogue there to consider. And so in that sense, I think the provincializing lens does something very important. It lends legitimacy and legibility to a project that was trying to be created and that didn't fit within a canon that was very well established and was squarely placed within Europe. And so in that sense, I think that it was extremely important from that point of view. And I just wanted to make that remark because it gives some power to the word, and the word neatly captured something, which I think we should, I think we should think a little bit more about that. That what was it capturing? I'm an over contextualist sometimes, but what were you capturing at the time? I think what you did capture allowed the flourishing and along with other fields of this expansion that it proved extremely important and decisive.
Thank you, Patricia. Dipesh.
Time is short, so I'll give brief responses. So to begin with, Bo's remark about modernization, the end of modernization and the beginning of globalization. And I think what you're saying is globally true. But in India, a critique of modernization had started in the 1970s. And the main person was Ashish Nandy, who was critiquing modernization and modernity from the 70s. And in some ways, Nandy created the ground for the meeting later between us Marxists and reading Gandhi, because Marxists didn't read Gandhi. So it's Nandy's interest. It's Nandy, and Nandy was influenced by Schumacher, Small is Beautiful, the entire, environmental movement. And they used to have a journal in Delhi called Lokayan, in which they were writing a lot about critical. And we began to read them later in the 80s. But the roots go back to those discussions within India, which reflected a kind of tiredness with modernization, big dams. And, the Chinese have another kind of tiredness now. When you speak to China, they say too much development, too much going on. But within India, there was that. So I'm just saying that there's a global narrative of decline of modernization. But in the global narrative, you have to remember that Deng Xiaoping starts his full modernization in 78, 79. So actually, and that quickly becomes China's global leap. To come to what Saurabh was saying is totally right about questions. And I often, as a teacher, when I'm talking to students, I often think about this problem in the humanities that most of the big thinkers are wrong. Nobody says that they're totally right. People find, if anybody was totally right, then everybody would have been of their following, right? If Freud was totally right, we'd all be Freudians. If Marx was totally right, all intelligent people would be Marxists. So it's not like anti-Marxists are stupid people. And so I say sometimes to myself and to my students as an ambition, I said, look, not as an ambition, but I say, look, one of the interesting things is that most of us we all ask good, interesting questions and give wrong answers, or even, ask interesting questions. But most of us make forgettable mistakes. And that's why we are forgotten. But these great people made such fantastically generative mistakes that you go and follow the tracks of their thoughts, not to arrive at the answer they gave, but the very way they thought teaches you something, teaches you to think. So I remember that when I was writing my thesis, I used to, at bedtime, my bedtime reading was The Interpretation of Dreams. I used to find Freud an extremely beautiful writer and a very good argumentator in very clear language. And so I used to read him for stimulation. And my friend Simon During, who was a professor of English in Melbourne, retired now. And Simon always used to say to me, Dipesh, if you can write an interesting book, that'll be great. He used to say, he said, don't try to write a correct book, because books are never correct. Other scholars come and find out what's wrong with them. But if it's stimulating, so it depends on how stimulating a book is. So when I think of Marx, and one mark of how stimulating a book remains is how often people go back and read those books. So I think of, when they celebrated 500 years of Machiavelli's Prince, and I thought, wow, people have been reading this book, this tiny little book, for 500 years. What did he do? And Guha, in Subaltern, Guha was always extremely encouraging. He always used to say, try and go to a fundamental question and stay with it as much as you can. So just go to the fundamental question. And I now realize, looking back, I didn't set out doing this, that all my books are basically about answering one question, which is, what is history? So when I came into history, as having done physics and business school and all that, My teacher in Calcutta got me to read 3 people: Collingwood, E.H. Carr's What is History, and Mark Bloch. And that question, what is history, clearly stayed with me. Because I used to find it very bizarre, because those historians in Calcutta would always say to you, if you produced a binary, they would say, Dipesh, reality is gray, it's not black and white. And I would say, but in my high school physics, I knew that gray is actually black and white mixed up. So why do you say it's gray and not black and white? Gray is black and white. But then I realized that they thought differently. They don't think, So this question, I was always interested in how do historians think, or how do I think as a historian? How does the discipline make me think? So now I realize that even with the climate change book, it is eventually all about what history is, what this discipline is, what this form of knowledge is. It came, what did it do to us? And I think, again, from there, I can easily segue on to what Manuela has put it more beautifully than I ever could. The whole project is of translation, except to say, Manuela, the translation happens even inside me. So when I came into subaltern studies and writing about peasants, and as an urban person, I don't know any peasants. So I kind of kept thinking, who am I thinking about? Who am I writing about? But the Indian middle class is such that we have domestic servants. And the domestic servant is actually a peasant in residence. He is connected to, or she is connected to villages. And every time the vaccinator came in modern India, part of modernization, they came to give us the injections against cholera or typhoid, and the injection was hurtful. People who would hide under the bed were me, my sister, and the servant. When my father, as a modernizer, would drag us out and give us a lecture on the benefit of vaccination. So I realized that my class formation is such that this person who was very proximate, and even physically proximate, because he could show me physical affection, but whom I not even half knew, because their families were in village. And this person, one of them, was very close to my dog, because the dog was the animal with whom this person could be most physically intimate and exchange affection. And I realized that I only half knew this person. So when I write subaltern studies, I translate that person whom I don't fully know. It's a translucent figure. So this problematic of translation, the metaphor of translation, runs right through this project of knowledge. So you're totally right, and you put it beautifully. And to come back to Patrícia and what you were saying, I completely appreciate it. I'll just tell you one story where so I'm aware of some of these developments in history of science. And Kapil Raj wrote a book on medicine and stuff, and Rennie Daston has been talking about this for a while. But here is the problem. The problem is, and I give you the example of anthropology, the subject. Now, in the 18th century, there were a lot of travelers traveling between Middle East and India, or even Southeast Asia and India. And now we have those travelogues. And my colleagues, Muzaffar Alam, who works on pre-colonial Mughal India, and Sajja Subramaniam in UCLA, they've written a book on these travelers. Within India, in that period, this travel literature existed, but they existed as individual books. And think of what happened in Europe with travel literature. So there's a man called Immanuel Kant who reads this travel literature and converts this literature into a source for giving a course called anthropology, in which Herder was a student in one of his classes. Right? So in other words, it tells me that Europe had an institution and had an institutional capacity to process the knowledge it was getting from different parts of the world in a very particular way. And India didn't have the same institutional capacity. And I think that institutional capacity is a large part of the story of great divergence that my colleague Pen Pomeranz writes about. But he doesn't talk about that. He goes to fossil fuel and other things. But I think the one reason why Europe dominated the world was because it internally created this deep institutional capacity. And that's, I think, one reason why climate science and even popularizing that science is basically an effort that comes out of Europe, North America, Australia, but out of the Western world. India and China are big actors, but people don't write popular books explaining what the problem is. So there's a kind of pretension of universalism, the pretension of being able to speak for the world, has something to do with this deep institutional capacity that makes it not just into a figment of one's imagination, but into practical things like classes, courses, books, disciplines, all of these things. So that's the only thing I have to, not disagreeing with you, but only rider and sort of add to what you said. Yeah. Jose, I think we're at the end of our time.
Thank you.
We've actually gone over it.
Yeah, thank you all very, very much for the conversation. I will just finish this session by sharing the web page of our journal, and actually here you can find all the articles and essays. Some of them we were talking about throughout this conversation. The photography on the front cover is from a Portuguese photographer, also researcher at our institute, Paulo Catrica. We don't know exactly know how to explain why this was the image we selected, but that's it. Thank you all very much, and perhaps in 2030 we will be here once again in order to have another discussion on the 30 years of provincializing Europe, probably. And thank you very much. Thank you, Dipesh.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and stay well. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.